Hi, and welcome to the Notepad Show. In today's episode, we're going to go over how to use ACES. We're going to take a project from start to finish and converting textures from JPEG PNG into ACES through RenderMan's TEX format. So let's get started. I'm going to bring up Houdini. I have a project already set. Keep this video as quick as we can and as short as we can. It's a lot of info. But I have a scene here where we're going to take a boulder and we're going to apply a PBR texture to it. Before I do that, though, I do want to give you a little bit of a primer, a little bit of information about ACES. I assume that you are somewhat familiar with it. Otherwise, why would you be watching this video? But you might be confused, or there's a lot of conflicting information out there. I'm hoping to sort of clean that up and give very distinct, clear information on what ACES is. ACES is not a file format per se. It is a workflow, a color space workflow. A lot of people want to call it color management. Knock yourself out, call it color management. But the important part is that ACES brings two things to the table, and it's why the VFX industry has adopted it across the board, and why it is part of what's called the VFX platform. ACES allows colors to be consistent throughout a studio pipeline, and that is incredibly important. There were problems in the past where studios had different color management and there were no standards, and the left hand wasn't able to talk to the right hand when it came to color, and multiple studios who happened to be working on the same film would have problems because their colors wouldn't match up. ACES definitely aimed to sort that out, and it has. So continuity in your color as you're going through your pipeline. Now, the pipeline for an individual artist can just be going from Substance Painter and Mari into RenderMan, and then RenderMan into Nuke, and then Nuke into DaVinci. So even an individual artist has a pipeline. Then the second reason that ACES is so wonderful is it brings a lot of dynamic range to your light response when you're lighting your scene and you are creating your textures and coloring your textures, adjusting colors within your shader network and manipulating your shader networks. It really brings a lot of detail and dynamic range to your scene. It does that because ACES works in a huge wide color gamut. A color gamut that's almost as big as what our eyes can see. And our eyes have a pretty big gamut. The problem is, textures aren't in that wide gamut. Textures come in and are authored in either a lower gamut, like a PNG or a JPEG, or they come in and they are authored in, EXR format, which is a wide color, a wide gamut format. When a texture is brought in through JPEG or PNG, there is a transform that has to happen, a setting that has to be set to say, take this JPEG or PNG file that's low color gamut and bring it into ACESCG. That setting, that transform is called sRGB texture. Alternatively, and this is just for color albedo maps, a alternate albedo map, that would be an albedo map that's an EXR, that would get a linear sRGB, or it's sometimes labeled sRGB linear, and that gets ACESified. That's a term I'm going to use throughout this video. That gets ACESified to a TEX file in RenderMan through the setting sRGB linear. HDR, the exact same setting as the alternate albedo map. It's a color map, and it's an EXR or a higher gamut format that gets a linear sRGB. Then you have data maps. These are the maps in a PBR that drive the shader but hold no color information. A normal map, a displacement map, or a roughness map. They're grayscale, black and white images. And there is the case that's not as normal or not as common, but it is something that you viewers are going to experience, and that is sometimes you'll have a texture that's already an ACES CG texture. It's already quote unquote ACESified. And that would be, a typical example would be a texture coming from Mari, which already has an ACES workflow built into it, or Substance Painter also has an ACES workflow. And in those cases, when you've configured, to use ACES in those programs and you're outputting an EXR, you want to apply none. And then it will be converted to ACES with no transform. So that's all I'm going to say about input IDT transforms. Most of this stuff in RenderMan, and I can only speak for RenderMan and Houdini, is done automatically in the texture manager. So why don't we do that right now? There are multiple ways to convert a texture to be ACES and to be ACES TEX. One is through the texture manager. That's a pre-conversion that we would do. And the other is a manual, and I'll show you both. I prefer to do my textures. I prefer to pre-convert my textures. So we're going to do that now. I'm going to go into the texture manager, and I'm going to go to where my textures are. And I am using Linux here, if you were curious. So I selected my directory, and it's actually doing the conversion now. And you know that it's converted when there's a checkbox. I've done this before, so it shows up, and it has a log file, so it shows that I've already done it once, but doing it again doesn't hurt anything. And as you can see, the albedo gets converted to sRGB texture. The displacement, that's a data map, gets applied a data transform. Normal gets a data transform. And roughness gets a data transform. These are the most common. These are the most common transforms you're going to see when you build your shader network coming from, let's say, Quixel. And that's the example I'm using. So I've already applied these textures. Now, something I wanted to bring up is I told you that you didn't have to use the texture manager, that you could set it manually and convert it manually. If you, let's say, pick this JPEG, you would set sRGB here, and it would do the conversion at render time. So when you would hit your IPR for the first time, it kicks off the conversion. The problem with that is you don't see anything on your screen in the IPR. You see like a placeholder texture while it's doing its conversion, and it's just sitting there wasting time. It's like, man, this isn't going to look good. It's a placeholder texture. You have to actually stop the IPR. Let the it's already doing the conversion batch, thing. So you just have to wait and then run the IPR again. So you have to run the IPR twice. And it's just, I don't know, it's just better if you pre-convert, in my opinion. But again, everybody's mileage may vary. So you would set it to sRGB texture for the JPEG. I'm going to set it back to the TEX file. Now this is important. You have to set it to none. You don't want to double convert your already ACES converted texture. All these TEX files are ACESified. So you set it to none. every single one of these is set to none. Okay. So I'm going to do a render now. And there's the object. Okay. So now that we have it in the if viewer as an IPR, I want to take what I'm seeing here, write out an EXR, and bring that into Nuke. So we're going to do that step right now. So I'm going to go to the out, and I'm just going to hit render to disk. So I'm writing out an EXR file. It's already ACES. I put that ACES CG there. It's good habit to have it labeled, but I have an EXR. It's already written out, and it should be done in a few seconds here. Doesn't take long for my machine to render, and there it goes. So it's rendered the image. I'm now going to bring Nuke over, and I'm going to go and I'm going to read in that file. So that file is now being brought in, and it's brought in as ACES. So I'm telling it, you're already a scene linear ACES file. You could have said default. The default's the same. These are what are called aliases. And here it is. So now we have some consistency. I'm going to show you the consistency right now. Here's the EXR that was written to disk, brought into Nuke, completely different DCC than RenderMan. Here's the RenderMan file, and this was an IPR that I wrote while I was in Houdini, and I wrote out through RenderMan, and they are identical. Now, I'm going to write out a JPEG. So it's a little bit different on output, and we're going to go over that now with these notes. So the output, or ODT transform, has two choices, and I did one of them already. I wrote out an EXR file staying in the ACES for the next pipeline. In that case, it was Nuke. But now I'm going to go from Nuke and write out a PNG file or a JPEG file. And I have two options here. I'm really only going to talk about ACES 1.3. ACES 1.2 is the exact same, except that it's labeled a little bit different, and it doesn't use a LUT anymore, so it's just a little bit different. I'll put links in the description on sort of the encyclopedia. There's a web page that has all kinds of information on ACES and what the differences are between the two versions. Again, this video is really about just doing the workflow. So when you write out your JPEG, and we are going to go to, we'll go here, and we're going to do ACES. Well, we're going to call it Boulder _ sRGB. .jpeg. Okay. Set the quality. I like 422. It's the color resolution I like. And we're going to set the transform type to display. meaning we are going to, what we're seeing here, which is in sRGB color space, believe it or not, kind of confusing. Yes, it is an ACESCG image, but it's showing up as sRGB so I can see it properly in the DCC. And that's done right here. So for temporarily, I'm seeing the sRGB output. And that is so I can do look dev in Nuke. If I set it to something other than that, the colors wouldn't be right. You'd see, it's already starting to look differently. This is where it should be. ACES 1.0 SRD video. This will be the default. So it's just saying, yeah, when you're, like doing your color grading and stuff, I know that you're on a monitor that's SRD video. But now we're going to write out a file that matches this, and it's going to be a JPEG, so you can open it up and your client, your friends, your grandmother will see this same exact image, and it will look the same to them on their monitor, given that they're at least running an sRGB monitor. There might be differences in the monitor manufacturers and stuff, but not to any great degree. And that would be for another video where you're doing color management at the device level, and that's not what this is about. So I'm going to do and hit render. So here's the JPEG. I'm going to bring that up. I'm just going to double click. I have a default viewer in Linux. So there it is. So now I have the JPEG, the EXR file, tone mapped, of course, in real time. And then the IPR that was done, 15 minutes ago. They're all identical. They're all the same. There's continuity there. And I'm going to show you one last image. It's a image of 3 blue balls that have a specularity on them, and an HDR is lighting them. All 3 balls are the same. And now I'm going to go over what makes them, how they were different when they first started. The ball on the left was a JPEG converted to ACES. Ball on the right was and it was sRGB texture. The ball on the right was an alternative albedo. Again, converted to ACES, but it was an EXR first. And then the middle one is just a blue ball. And you should know, both the textures were just pure blue JPEG, pure blue EXR. And then the third was a color picker. So even the color picker in your DCC is ACESified. So, with all that said, I want to bring back Houdini and just show some kind of cool stuff regarding dynamic range and what is so cool about ACES and dynamic range. So we have this wonderful rock. I have only one light lighting it. And the first thing I'm going to do is the obligatory bring up the lights. Now you'll notice as I bring up the power of the light, and it's again just an overhead light, it's not blowing out the rock. You can still see a ton of detail. It's a bright light. It's incredibly too bright for, any kind of scene, but it's still holding up, and I can go brighter and brighter. And it's only when I get to a crazy 10, I'll start to see artifacting. And even then, I'm not seeing artifacting quite yet. Now I'm starting to see a lot more artifacting here in the shadows. And then now it's at a crazy level where it's just ridiculous. but it's holding its highlight. But now I'm going to do something that I have not seen in any of the YouTube videos about Aces. And that is I'm going to go low, because I think that's absolutely just as important. So we're here. Now we're going lower, lower, lower. And look at this light response. I mean, I'm seeing lighting right here. I'm seeing lighting on the floor. I can still see an outline of the rock. It might be hard to see on YouTube, but it's there. And I can go lower and lower. And I can still see detail on the floor. Right here. I would have to go just a little bit further. But it's holding up. It's not necessarily crushing black. It's still holding on to detail. And I just think that's really cool. That's all I got. So thank you for watching. Thank you for listening to this long video, and have a great time with playing with Aces. It's a game changer.